Good morning. We are gathered here to discuss a subject that is as old as civilization itself, yet remains persistently invisible to those who embody it. We are here to dissect the mentality of the oppressor. When we use the term oppressor, we are not merely referring to the tyrant, the dictator, or the explicit sadist. Those are the caricatures of evil. The oppressor I wish to analyze today is far more common, far more insidious, and far more psychologically complex. The oppressor is the beneficiary of a system that grants them unearned advantage, what we call privilege, at the expense of another group. The oppressor is the normal citizen of an abnormal society. The central thesis of this lecture is that the mentality of the oppressor is not primarily one of hatred, but one of narcissism. It is not a psychology of cruelty for its own sake, but a psychology of justification. The oppressor cannot sleep at night if they believe they are evil. Therefore, they must construct an entire worldview, a philosophical, biological, or theological architecture that explains why the suffering of the oppressed is necessary, deserved, or imaginary. To understand the oppressor, we must abandon the binary of good people and bad people. We must, instead, look at the structure of the ego under conditions of unearned power. To understand the oppressor, we must first understand the invention of the other. Prior to the agricultural revolution and the formation of hierarchical states, human societies were largely egalitarian. Domination over nature was the primary struggle. Domination over other humans was inefficient. The shift from kinship-based societies to state-based societies required a radical psychological shift. It required the invention of hierarchy. How do you convince a man who works the land that he is inferior to a king who taxes him? How do you convince a conquered tribe that they are naturally suited to servitude? You invent myth, you invent religion, you invent race. The mentality of the oppressor is born in the moment of legitimation. The oppressor does not merely seize power, they claim the right to power. The ancient Egyptians distinguished between rikit commoners and pat elites, claiming the former were created from the tears of Horus. Aristotle declared that some men are slaves by nature. The Spanish Inquisition justified colonization by demanding the conversion of souls, thereby framing conquest as salvation. This is the first pillar of the oppressive mentality, the denial of shared humanity. The oppressor must view the oppressed as a different kind of being. This is not merely prejudice, it is ontology. The oppressed are categorized as closer to animals, closer to children, or closer to demons. By defining the oppressed as lacking certain attributes, reason, discipline, civilization, soul, the oppressor justifies their role as the guardian, the parent, the master. Frantz Fanon described this as the process of epidermalization, the inscription of inferiority onto the skin. The oppressor looks at the oppressed and sees not a person who has been denied education, but a person who is inherently ignorant. They see not a person who has been denied capital, but a person who is inherently lazy. This is the comfort of oppression. It turns social problems into biological facts. The second pillar of the oppressive mentality is psychological projection. The oppressor possesses a superego, a conscience that demands moral coherence. To hold power unjustly creates cognitive dissonance. The mind cannot tolerate the contradiction of, I am a good person and I cause suffering. To resolve this, the mind exports the guilt. Consider the phenomenon of the black rapist myth in the American South. Historical records show that white supremacists projected their own history of sexual violence against enslaved black women onto black men. The fear of black male sexuality was a mirror. The oppressor, guilty of rape and exploitation, accused the victim of the very crime he himself committed. This is not hypocrisy. It is a defense mechanism. The oppressor must believe that the oppressed are dangerous, lascivious, or cunning, because if the oppressed are docile and innocent, then the violence inflicted upon them is indefensible. Therefore, the oppressor needs the oppressed to be a threat. We see this in every structure of domination. The colonial administrator in India claimed the natives were deceitful and untrustworthy, justifying the rigid legal system of the Raj. The corporate executive claims workers are greedy for demanding higher wages while accruing millions in bonuses. The patriarchal husband claims women are hysterical or irrational, justifying his control over family finances. Projection allows the oppressor to view their own aggression as reaction. They are not the aggressor. They are the protector. They are not attacking. They are defending civilization, family, or order against the chaotic nature of the other. We are often taught that the problem with oppressors is that they lack empathy. This is incorrect. The oppressor possesses empathy, but it is selective and inverted. Empathy, the ability to feel the emotions of another, is a human universal. The slave owner felt empathy for his chores, for his fellow slave owners. He did not feel empathy for the slave because he had successfully categorized the slave as property. To empathize with property would be a category error. This is the perversion. The oppressor must deactivate empathy for the target group. This deactivation requires constant ideological maintenance. It is not a passive state. It is an active suppression. Albert Memmi, in his seminal work The Colonizer and the Colonized, noted that the colonizer lives in a state of constant unease. They cannot fully enjoy their privileged position because they know, at some level, that it is built on a lie. They therefore engage in a series of bad faith negotiations. There are two types of oppressors, according to Memmi. 1. The colonizer who accepts. He fully embraces the colonial creed. He believes the natives are inferior. He lives a life of neurotic anxiety, constantly reinforcing the walls of his ideology against the reality of the humanity of the colonized. 2. The colonizer who refuses. He sees the injustice. He condemns the system. Yet he continues to benefit from it. He is the liberal oppressor. He pays his servants. He advocates for reform, but he does not dismantle the house in which he lives. The second type is the most psychologically interesting. He suffers from moral masochism. He is aware of his complicity, yet he is paralyzed by the fear of losing his identity and his security. His empathy is a source of pain, not action. He is the ally who stops short of revolution. Oppression is rarely maintained by violence alone. Violence is expensive and unsustainable. The most efficient oppression is the one the oppressed accept as natural. Here we turn to Antonio Gramsci and his concept of hegemony. The oppressor does not merely rule through the state, armies, police, courts. They rule through civil society, schools, churches, media, family. The mentality of the oppressor includes a sophisticated understanding, often instinctive rather than intellectual, that if you control the narrative, you control the rebellion. The oppressor must ensure that the oppressed internalize their own inferiority. This is achieved through the colonization of the imagination. The history books are written by the conquerors. The beauty standards are set by the masters. The language of the oppressor becomes the language of success. The oppressed child learns that to be good is to be like the oppressor. They straighten their hair. They change their names. They abandon their mother tongue. This is not a choice. It is a survival mechanism. The oppressor views this assimilation as proof of their benevolence. They say they want to be like us. They recognize our superiority. The oppressor does not see the violence of erasure. They see the gift of civilization. Paulo Freire, in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, identifies the tragic flaw in this dynamic. The oppressed often harbor a profound, subconscious fear of freedom. They are so thoroughly conditioned to view the oppressor as the ideal human that they cannot imagine existence without them. The oppressor's greatest victory is not the chain on the body, but the chain in the mind. We must not be purely idealistic. The mentality of the oppressor is rooted in material reality. It is easier to feel superior when you are well fed. The oppressor has a vested economic interest in maintaining the hierarchy. This is not always conscious greed. It is often fear of fall. The white working-class voter in the Rust Belt who votes against his own economic interest to maintain racial hierarchy is not acting irrationally. He is acting on the psychology of relative deprivation. He may be poor, but he is not the lowest. He has a psychological wage, the wage of whiteness, of masculinity, of citizenship. This wage is often worth more to him than his actual paycheck. To dismantle racism would be to remove the floor beneath his feet. He would no longer have someone to look down on. And he fears that if everyone is equal, he will be revealed as the truly mediocre one. This is the aristocracy of labor effect. The oppressor clings to their badges of dignity. This explains why groups historically have turned on even more marginalized groups. It is the psychology of the drowning man pushing others down to keep his own head above water. The oppressor thus develops a scarcity mentality. They believe that rights are a zero-sum game. If women gain power, men lose it. If black people gain jobs, white people lose them. They cannot conceive of a world of abundance because they have never experienced social abundance. Their identity is built on the scarcity of status. One of the most terrifying aspects of the oppressive mentality is its ability to become banal. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, coined the phrase, the banality of evil. Eichmann was not a monster. He was a bureaucrat. He filed paperwork. He optimized train schedules. He never personally killed anyone. His mentality was not one of sadism, but of careerism. This is the modern oppressor. They do not need to hate. They need only to be indifferent. They need only to follow the rules. The mid-level manager who denies a loan to a minority applicant based on a neutral algorithm is an oppressor. The university administrator who defends legacy admissions because tradition is an oppressor. They are not burning crosses. They are citing policy. This bureaucratic mentality provides the ultimate moral insulation. The oppressor abdicates personal responsibility to the system. I didn't make the rules, they say. I just work here. This is the lie of the functionary. By claiming neutrality, they become the sharpest weapon of the oppressor. They are the ink on the deportation order. They are the key in the prison lock. They are the hand on the gavel. We cannot ignore the libidinal dimension of oppression. Power is erotic. The slave master's access to the bodies of enslaved women was not incidental to slavery. It was central. The rape of colonized women was not a side effect. It was a demonstration of total dominance. The oppressor derives a deep, often repressed, sexual gratification from the subjugation of the other. This is the psychoanalytic dimension. Simone de Beauvoir argued that man defines woman as the other in order to define himself as the subject. His dominance is existential. He needs her submission to validate his virility. In colonial literature, the land itself is feminized. It is virgin territory, waiting to be penetrated and tamed by the masculine explorer. This is not mere metaphor. It is the language of rape. The oppressor treats the world as a body to be conquered. This eroticism of power creates a specific pathology, jealousy and paranoia. The oppressor is obsessed with the sexuality of the oppressed. They fear miscegenation. They create laws against intermarriage. They police the bodies of women in their own group to ensure purity. This paranoia reveals the oppressor's insecurity. They know deep down that their power is artificial. They know that if the playing field were level, they might not be chosen. Their laws against mixing are an admission of their own inadequacy. The oppressor loves the word natural. Inequality is framed as inevitable. Poverty is framed as natural selection. War is framed as eternal. This is the conservative sublime, the belief that the current order is not merely right, but cosmically ordained. If hierarchy is natural, then resistance is unnatural. The revolutionary is framed not as a freedom fighter, but as a disturbance in the natural order. They are a virus, a cancer, a plague upon the body politic. The oppressor adopts this deterministic worldview to absolve themselves. They did not create the system. They merely inherited it. They are not responsible for the suffering of the poor. It is the invisible hand of the market. They are not responsible for the legacy of slavery. It happened 200 years ago. This narrative of inevitability is a sedative. It numbs the conscience. It allows the oppressor to view the future with complacency. The poor will always be with us, they say, misquoting scripture. This is the intellectual laziness of the oppressor. They refuse to imagine alternatives because to imagine an alternative is to indict the present. Their mentality is anti-utopian. They fear the new world because they are kings in the old one. Part X, the crisis of recognition. We arrive now at the moment of fracture. The moment when the oppressed refuse to remain objects and declare themselves subjects. For the oppressor, this is an existential crisis. Hegel described this as the life and death struggle for recognition. The master achieved his identity through the recognition of the slave. But the recognition of the slave was worthless because it was coerced. The master knows the slave is lying. The master knows the slave does not truly respect him. The slave merely fears him. Therefore, the master's identity is built on a foundation of sand. He spends his life demanding recognition he knows is false. When the slave rises up, the master faces a choice. He can fight and risk death, or he can recognize the slave as an equal. Both options terrify him. To fight is to admit the system has failed. To recognize equality is to dissolve his own identity. This is the psychology of the backlash. When the oppressed begin to gain rights, the oppressor does not feel relief. They feel annihilation. The loss of dominance feels like the loss of self. We see this in the rage of the white supremacist watching a black quarterback kneel during the anthem. The quarterback is not harming anyone. He is not taking property. But he is withdrawing his recognition. He is refusing to perform the ritual of deference. For the oppressor, this gesture is experienced as a physical blow. This is why integration is resisted so fiercely, because of racial purity, but because of status anxiety. If I must call you Mr., who am I? The modern oppressor, particularly the Western, liberal, educated oppressor, suffers acutely from guilt. This guilt is not a sign of moral health. It is a new form of paralysis. The oppressor watches documentaries about the suffering they benefit from. They read articles about systemic racism. They attend diversity workshops. They feel terrible, and then do nothing. This is performative guilt. It is a transaction. The oppressor feels the emotion of guilt and assumes that the emotion itself is payment. They have paid the moral tax. They can now return to their comfortable life. This is the opiate of the ally. It allows the oppressor to maintain the aesthetic of goodness without the sacrifice of power. True solidarity requires the oppressor to divest. It requires them to give up something, their job, their status, their safety. Performative guilt requires only a credit card donation and a social media post. The oppressor must ask themselves, is my guilt productive, or is it just another luxury my privilege affords me? The oppressor believes they have better taste. They believe their music is more sophisticated, their art more refined, their architecture more civilized. They view the culture of the oppressed as either primitive or exotic. This is cultural imperialism. It is the belief that Mozart is objectively superior to the blues, that Renaissance painting is objectively superior to African masks. This is not merely preference. It is power disguised as taste. The oppressor curates the oppressed. They collect primitive art. They appreciate the authenticity of the ghetto, provided they have a security gate and a safe distance. They consume the culture of the oppressed while denying the humanity of the producers. This is the ultimate act of consumption. The oppressor eats the soul of the oppressed and calls it appreciation. They wear bindis at music festivals and dreadlocks in Brooklyn, yet they vote for policies that keep the originators of those cultures in poverty. This is the commodification of resistance. The oppressor takes the symbols of rebellion slogans, hairstyles, music, and strips them of their political content. They sell them back to the masses as fashion. The safety pin becomes an accessory. The raised fist becomes an emoji. The oppressor neutralizes the threat of the other by absorbing it. They do not need to destroy the culture. They need only to own it. The oppressive mind is a reductionist mind. It prefers simple stories. Good versus evil, civilized versus savage, hardworking versus lazy. It cannot tolerate ambiguity. It requires the world to be legible and categorized. Why? Because ambiguity is threatening. If the oppressed are complex, if they are both sinner and saint, both victim and agent, then the moral calculus of oppression collapses. The oppressor can no longer justify their dominance as a civilizing mission if the uncivilized are producing philosophy and poetry. Therefore, the oppressor engages in stereotype. The stereotype is not a description, it is a cage. It flattens the individual into a type: the Jewish banker, the lazy Mexican, the angry black woman. These stereotypes serve a dual function. They dehumanize the oppressed, and they discipline the oppressor's own group. They tell the white man, Be industrious, or you will be like them. They tell the heterosexual man. Be stoic, or you will be like them. The stereotype is a prison for everyone, but the oppressor mistakes the bars for a backbone. Is the oppressor damned? Is there no escape from this architecture of domination? I believe there is. But it requires a radical psychological and material transformation. It is not enough to be woke. It is not enough to feel guilty. It is not enough to read books. The oppressor must undergo a process that Paulo Freire called conversion. This is not religious conversion. It is an existential reorientation. Conversion requires the oppressor to do three things. 1. Relinquish power. This is the hardest step. The oppressor must accept that justice requires their discomfort. They must be willing to lose their job, their status, their security, for the cause of liberation. Without this willingness, their solidarity is merely theater. 2. Listen without defense. The oppressor must accept the narrative of the oppressed as true, even when it contradicts their self-image. When a woman says, "You are sexist," the man must not say, "But I respect women." He must shut his mouth and listen. His intention is irrelevant. His impact is the only metric. 3. Accept guilt without wallowing. The oppressor must acknowledge their complicity without using that guilt as an excuse for inaction. They must move through the shame and arrive at responsibility. They must say, "I did not build this system, but I benefit from it, and I am responsible for dismantling it." This transformation is rare. It is easier to remain the benevolent colonizer, the liberal paternalist, the diversity-minded CEO. True conversion requires the death of the ego. We have traced the mentality of the oppressor from its origins in myth and projection, through its maintenance via bureaucracy and consumerism, to its crisis in the face of liberation. What have we learned? We have learned that the oppressor is not a monster. They are a human being trapped in a pathological relationship with power. They are trapped by their fear of falling, their need for recognition, and their investment in a lie. But we have also learned that the lie is unsustainable. History, despite its regressions, moves toward the expansion of the moral circle. The slaves became citizens. The colonized became nations. The subaltern speaks. The mentality of the oppressor is being rendered obsolete, not by guilt, not by charity, but by the relentless struggle of the oppressed. Every movement for liberation forces the oppressor to look in the mirror. Every uprising cracks the architecture of domination. The question is not whether the oppressor will change. The question is whether they will change voluntarily or whether they will be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the future. I urge you to look inward. You are in this room. You breathe the air of privilege. You speak the language of the academy. You are, in some way, the oppressor. What will you that knowledge? Will you cling to your status, your comfort, your denial? Or will you step into the terrifying, liberating space of solidarity? The choice, as always, is yours. But know this, the architecture is collapsing. The question is not if it will fall, but whether you will be crushed by the rubble, or whether you will help us build something new. Thank you.